She was 20 years old and, for all intents and purposes, homeless. She had no family left to speak of, no prospects, and a final settlement of £5 to her name. And with 2 of those pounds, she bought the derelict shell of Greyfell House in the quiet country parish of Marlow-on-Trent. The estate had been stripped to its bones, but what nobody knew, what the auctioneers and creditors had overlooked, was that the old strong-room set into its foundation had never once been opened. Stay close and listen to this story of what was found inside. We love to know where you're watching from, so please, leave a note in the comments. Hannah Whitaker had learned the world through the grain of wood. Her father, a carpenter of quiet skill and gentler disposition, had taught her its language before she could properly read books. He taught her how to read the life of a tree in the patterns of its timber, the tight rings of a hard winter, the wider, more generous bands of a good summer, the swirling eye of a healed-over branch. He had died when she was 12, leaving her with little more than a set of his smaller tools and a perfect, palm-sized carving of a wren, its head cocked as if listening for a song. That wren was her most treasured possession. After his passing, she had been taken in by her mother's brother, a country solicitor named Arthur Pendleton, a man who dealt in facts and figures, not in the quiet poetry of oak and ash. His first wife had been kind enough in a distant, preoccupied way, and had allowed Hannah to spend her afternoons with Mr. Elias Vance, the village cabinetmaker. Mr. Vance was a widower, a man whose silence was as dense and solid as the mahogany he favored. He never offered praise easily, but he saw in Hannah the same steady hands and patient eye her father had possessed. Under his tutelage, she learned the art of the dovetail joint, the patient rasp of a wood file, the precise angle for a mortise and tenon. She learned to mend what was broken, to see the integrity of a piece of furniture beneath layers of neglect and damage. She learned that patience and good tools could restore almost anything. It was a skill that settled deep in her bones, a form of solace and a way of making sense of a world that often felt fractured. Life in her uncle's house was tolerable until he remarried after his first wife's sudden death. The new Mrs. Pendleton was a woman who valued appearances above all else. She saw Hannah not as a niece, but as a relic of a less prosperous past, a quiet, dusty presence, who did not fit with the new furnishings and social aspirations. Hannah was a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of her new life, and she made no secret of her desire to see it snipped. The ejection, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation or a tearful farewell. It was as cold and quiet as the solicitor's trade itself. A month after her Uncle Arthur succumbed to a sudden inflammation of the lungs, a letter arrived for Hannah. It was not from her step-aunt, but from her uncle's law partner in the next town over. The vellum was thick, the ink a stark, unforgiving black. It stated, in language scrubbed clean of all sentiment, that Mr. Pendleton's estate was heavily encumbered with debts, largely from expenditures made in the last 2 years of his life. After all creditors were satisfied, there was nothing left. The house, the practice, everything, was to be sold. As she was not his blood relative but merely a ward, no legal provision had been made for her. However, in recognition of her years of quiet service in the household, her step-aunt had authorized a final disbursement of £5. She was to vacate the premises within the week. Hannah read the letter twice, in the stillness of her small attic room. There was no anger, only a profound and hollow emptiness. She did not cry. Crying felt like a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she began to pack. It did not take long. She wrapped her father's tools, the small block plane, the set of chisels, the fret saw, in oiled cloth, and placed them in a sturdy canvas satchel. The little wooden wren went into the pocket of her dress, its smooth, familiar shape, a small anchor in the rising tide of uncertainty. She packed her 2 spare blouses, her mending kit, and the copy of Robinson Crusoe Mr. Vance had given her. The rest of her meager belongings she left behind. On the final morning, she walked through the house one last time. It already felt like a stranger's home, full of objects she had dusted and polished, but never truly touched. Her step-aunt did not come down to see her off. A housemaid, a young girl named Clara, whose torn apron Hannah had mended just the week before, pressed a small, paper-wrapped package of bread and cheese into her hand at the back door. Her eyes full of a pity Hannah could not bring herself to acknowledge. She walked down the gravel drive without looking back. The 5 sovereigns heavy in her purse, the weight of her past, settled into the canvas satchel on her shoulder. The gate clicked shut behind her. A small, definitive sound, marking the end of one life and the start of another. The journey was a blur of gray skies and the rhythmic, jolting sway of the public coach. Hannah paid her fare to Marlow-on-Trent, a village name she had picked from a county map simply because it was far enough away to feel like a true departure, and it lay on a river, which she imagined might be a pleasant thing. For 2 days, she sat wedged between a snoring farmer and a woman with a restless baby, watching the familiar hedgerows and rolling fields of her childhood dissolve into a landscape that was subtly different. The stone of the cottages, a darker gray, the hills steeper and more severe. The air inside the coach was thick with the smell of damp wool, pipe smoke, and unwashed bodies. At night, they stopped at coaching inns, where she would buy a mug of weak tea and a piece of bread, eating alone, in a corner of the common room, her satchel held firmly on her lap. She spoke to no one, and no one spoke to her. She was simply another traveler, a quiet figure, in a plain brown dress, her face pale with fatigue and an unspoken grief. When the coach finally rattled to a stop in the market square of Marlow-on-Trent, she felt a profound sense of dislocation. The village was larger than she had imagined, built of sturdy, smoke-stained stone along a wide, fast-flowing river. The air smelled of coal fires, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of a blacksmith's forge. She secured a room for a few nights, at a modest establishment called the Angler's Rest, paying the landlady with a handful of shillings that seemed to vanish from her purse with alarming speed. Her room was small and cold, with a single window overlooking a narrow, cobbled alleyway. For the first time since leaving her uncle's house, a wave of desolation washed over her. She sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the village settling into evening. The clang of a distant bell, the clatter of horses on the cobbles, the low murmur of voices from the tavern below. She took the wooden wren from her pocket, its familiar weight a small, solid comfort. She had 4 pounds and 12 shillings left. It was a terrifyingly small amount to stand between her and utter destitution. She knew she had to find work, and quickly, but first, she needed to find a place, however humble, to simply exist. The next morning, driven by a need for purpose, she began to walk the perimeter of the village. It was on a notice board outside the parish church, tacked between a flyer for a lost sheep and a list of Sunday services, that she saw it. The notice was handwritten in a solicitor's precise, spidery script. It announced the final sale of the remaining assets of the bankrupt Penhaligon estate. The house, Greyfell, had been sold for its timber and stone. The contents had been auctioned off months ago. What remained was the plot of land itself, 3 overgrown acres, and the foundational shell of the house, including, the notice specified, 1 iron-bound strong room of indeterminate age and content, the key being lost. The price for the lot, to be sold as is, was 2 pounds sterling. A flicker of something, not hope, but a grim, practical curiosity, stirred in Hannah. 2 pounds. It would leave her with almost nothing, but it would be hers, a piece of land, a foundation, a room that could not be breached. She followed the directions on the notice, walking a mile out of the village, along a muddy lane, until she came to a pair of dilapidated stone gateposts. The house, or what was left of it, sat on a low rise overlooking the river. It was a skeleton. The roof was gone, leaving the great oak trusses exposed to the sky, like the ribs of a beached whale. Most of the floorboards had been pried up. The windows were empty, gaping holes, and piles of rubble lay where walls had once stood. It was a place of profound and utter ruin. But as she picked her way through the debris-strewn ground floor, she saw it. Set into the thickest part of the north-facing stone foundation was the strong room. It was not a door, so much as a declaration. 3 inches of solid oak, bound with 6 thick, iron straps, bolted through the wood. The lock was a monstrous thing of brass and iron, a complex mechanism of plates and tumblers, all seized with rust. The door was set so perfectly into the dressed stone of the foundation that it seemed to have grown there. It was immovable, impenetrable, a stubborn knot of history that had resisted the complete dismantling of the house. Hannah walked around it, running her hand over the cold iron and the rough, pitted surface of the stone. She understood why it had been left. The cost of blasting it out or forcing it open would have been more than the value of the scrap iron. It was an object of pure, obstinate permanence. In that moment, standing in the ruin, Hannah made her decision. She would buy it. She would buy this place of endings, this stubborn, locked room. It was a fool's choice, a wild gamble with her last few coins. But it was the only choice that felt like her own. She walked back to the village and presented herself at the solicitor's office. A small, dusty room smelling of paper and sealing wax. The solicitor, a man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked at her with undisguised astonishment when she placed 2 sovereigns on his desk. He explained again that she was buying a ruin, a piece of useless land and a locked box nobody could open. She simply nodded. "I understand," she said. He shrugged, drew up the deed of sale, and watched as she signed her name, Hannah Whitaker, in clear, steady script. The first few weeks were the hardest. Hannah spent her remaining money on a sturdy tent, a few blankets, and a small supply of flour, salt, and tea. She pitched the tent in the lee of what had been the west wing of the house, a space partially sheltered from the wind that swept up from the river. She spent her days clearing rubble, sorting stone from splintered timber, her hands quickly becoming calloused and sore. The work was grueling, but it was honest. Every stone she moved was an act of claiming the place as her own. The strong room door became the focus of her quiet study. Each morning, with a mug of hot tea in her hands, she would examine it. She traced the lines of the iron straps, probed the keyhole with a piece of wire, and tapped the surface of the oak, listening to the solid, unyielding sound. She knew her own tools were useless against it. This was a problem not of wood, but of iron and time. After a week of solitary contemplation, she knew she needed help. She walked back into Marlow-on-Trent, not to the shops or the church, but to the source of the metallic tang she had smelled on her first day, the blacksmith's forge. The smith was a man named Abel Thorne, broad-shouldered and gray-bearded, with eyes the color of a stormy sky. He listened to her request without expression, wiping his hands on a leather apron. "The old Penhaligon strong room," he said, his voice a low rumble. I know it. My father knew it. They say the devil himself forged that lock." He looked at her, a slip of a girl in a worn dress, and shook his head. "There's no key, miss, and I'll not ruin my hammers trying to break it." Hannah met his gaze steadily. "I don't want to break it," she said. "I want to open it. I thought perhaps the hinges." Mr. Thorne stopped, a flicker of interest in his eyes. He looked at her hands, noting the calluses and the faint lines of ingrained dirt. These were not the hands of a gentlewoman. "The hinges," he repeated slowly. "Aye, the lock is a boast. The hinges are the truth of it." He agreed to come the next morning. He arrived with a heavy toolbox and a long tempered steel bar. For 3 hours they worked. He showed her how to heat the massive iron hinge pins with a small, portable brazier, and then, while the metal was expanded, how to use the bar and a sledgehammer to slowly, painstakingly drive the pins upward. It was a slow, brutal, yet strangely delicate process. With the fall of each blow, a shower of rust and a deep, groaning echo. Finally, with a shriek of tortured metal, the last pin came free. The great door, no longer anchored to its frame, sagged forward. Together, they heaved it open. The air that spilled out was cold, dry, and ancient, smelling of dust and time itself. Inside, the small, stone-lined room was bare, save for 2 objects placed in the center of the floor. A heavy, iron-strapped oak chest, and beside it, a smaller, leather-bound document box. With a shared look of reverence, Mr. Thorne helped her carry them out into the daylight. The chest was not locked. Lifting the heavy lid revealed stacks of gold sovereigns, neatly wrapped in oilcloth, glinting in the pale sun. But it was the document box that held Hannah's attention. Inside, atop a stack of deeds and papers, was a letter, the ink faded, but still perfectly legible. It began, "To whomever has the patience to open what I have closed." Hannah sat on a block of fallen stone and read the letter aloud, her voice clear in the quiet air. It was dated 1688 and signed by a Silas Croft. He described himself as a master stonemason who had built this house, Greyfell, for his wife Eleanor. They had saved for years to build it, a home to fill with children they would never have, as Eleanor had died of a fever the year it was completed. Heartbroken, Silas had created this room to hold their savings and the deed to the house, which he had put in her name. He wrote, "I have no heir, and no heart to live here alone. I leave it to God's providence. Should this house fall, may this room endure. What is within is for you. Use it to build, not to flee. Use it to make a home." At the bottom of the box, beneath the papers, was a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet. Hannah unwrapped it. It was a stonemason's plumb bob, flawlessly crafted from polished brass, and a dark, heavy wood she recognized as lignum vitae. It was a tool of perfect balance and purpose, an object of a craftsman's love. She held it in one hand, and the wooden wren in the other. Tears finally came, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of connection to a man she had never known, a stranger who had reached across a century and a half to give her a chance to build. The discovery of Silas Croft's legacy changed everything. The gold sovereigns amounted to just over £300, a sum that was not a vast fortune, but was more than enough to transform Hannah's prospects from mere survival to the possibility of a future. She did not rush. She spent 2 days in her tent, carefully planning, her mind working with the same methodical precision she applied to a piece of furniture. Her first priority was the house itself. It needed a roof before the autumn rains began. She walked to a small quarry she had seen on her journey, a place where they cut the same dark gray slate that lay in shattered piles around Greyfell. She placed an order for enough slate to cover the main wing of the house, paying in coin, which earned her a respectful nod from the quarry master. Next, she found a man in the village, a roofer, named Mr. Hemlock, who was known for his skill and his honesty. He came to inspect the great oak trusses and declared them sound. "Good timber in this house," he grunted, looking at the massive, hand-hewn beams. They built things to last back then. He agreed to the work for a fair price. While Mr. Hemlock and his 2 sons worked on the roof, their hammers echoing across the valley, Hannah turned her attention to the windows. She spent the sovereigns sparingly, buying panes of glass, linseed oil, and putty in the village. The window frames themselves, the sashes and mullions, were her own work. She salvaged what timber she could from the wreckage, planing away the weathered surfaces to reveal the good wood beneath. She set up a makeshift workshop in the most sheltered corner of the ruin and began her craft. The familiar scent of sawdust, the satisfying rasp of the plane, the precise tap of the chisel, these were her comforts. She worked from dawn until dusk, her hands remembering the lessons of her father and Mr. Vance. Slowly, painstakingly, window by window, she began to enclose the house, turning the gaping holes back into openings that could hold light and keep out the wind. People in the village began to take notice. The sight of smoke rising from the quarry, the sound of hammering from the roof, and the quiet, solitary figure of the young woman working amidst the ruins became a subject of curiosity, and then of quiet respect. One evening, a woman named Mrs. Gable, the grocer's wife, appeared at the edge of the property, carrying a covered basket. "You must be chilled to the bone out here," she said, her voice kind. "I've brought you some stew." Hannah, exhausted and covered in sawdust, could only stammer her thanks. The simple, warm generosity of the act moved her more than the gold itself. It was the first strand in a thread of community that was beginning to weave itself around her. As autumn settled over Marlow-on-Trent, Greyfell House began to resemble a home once more. The roof was complete, a handsome expanse of dark slate that shone in the rain. The windows were glazed, their small, square panes reflecting the changing colors of the sky. Hannah had laid new floorboards in 2 of the ground floor rooms, using sturdy pine sourced from a local timber merchant. She plastered the walls herself, a messy, difficult job she learned from a book she bought. Her first few attempts uneven, but her persistence resulting in smooth, clean surfaces. She moved out of the tent and into one of the finished rooms, sleeping on a simple mattress on the floor, but it was a room with a solid roof and a window that closed, and it felt like a palace. With the house now weather-tight, she turned her thoughts to her own livelihood. She had a skill, and now she had a place to practice it. She designated the largest of the restored ground floor rooms as her workshop. She built a long, sturdy workbench from salvaged oak beams, its surface worn smooth by decades of use in its previous life. She bought a lathe and a few larger tools she needed, and hung her father's smaller tools in a neat row on the wall. Above the door, she hung a simple, hand-carved sign, Greyfell Restorations, furniture mended and repaired. Her first customer was the Reverend Michael Ashworth. He arrived one afternoon with the parish records under his arm, having taken an interest in the history of her property. He had found the entry for Silas Croft and his wife, Eleanor, confirming the story in the letter. He then sheepishly asked if she might be able to look at a small, split reading table from the vicarage. Hannah repaired it with a butterfly joint, so fine it was almost invisible. The Reverend was so pleased he spoke of her skill to his congregation. Soon, a slow but steady stream of work began to arrive. A farmer with a broken chair, the innkeeper with a warped tabletop, and even the local squire's wife, who sent a delicate writing desk with a peeling veneer. Hannah treated each piece with the same meticulous care, whether it was a humble milking stool or a fine piece of mahogany. Her work was her reputation, honest, fair, and built to last. The community, which had first watched her with suspicion, now began to accept her. Young Tom, a farmer's son, offered to help her clear the overgrown gardens in exchange for a share of the vegetables they would grow come spring. Mr. Thorne, the blacksmith, forged her a new set of fire irons as a gift. Mrs. Gable made sure to set aside the best cuts of bacon for her. She was no longer the strange girl who bought the ruin. She was Hannah Whitaker, the joiner at Greyfell. She had a place, a purpose, and a name that was known and respected in the small world of Marlow-on-Trent. The first snow of winter had fallen, blanketing the valley in a soft, silent white. Inside Greyfell, a fire crackled in the hearth of the main living room, casting a warm, flickering light on the newly plastered walls. The room smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and the pine boughs Hannah had placed on the mantelpiece. She had spent the evening polishing a small side table, the final step in a long restoration, and now she sat in a simple wooden chair, her hands finally still in her lap. The house was quiet around her, a deep, restful silence that was no longer empty, but full of the presence of a home. On the mantel, 2 objects sat side by side. One was the small wooden wren her father had carved, its tiny form seeming to hold all the warmth of her memory of him. The other was Silas Croft's plumb bob, its brass and dark wood gleaming in the firelight. They were objects made by craftsmen, by men who understood that love and care could be worked into physical things, made to endure. She thought of Mr. Vance, the cabinet maker, and the quiet way he had taught her that every piece of wood had its own story, its own strength. He, her father, and Silas Croft were all connected, a lineage of quiet skill and integrity that she now felt a part of. She thought of the cold solicitor's letter and the £5 that had felt like both an insult and an impossible sum. Then she thought of the £2 she had paid for this place, this skeleton of a house that everyone else had seen as worthless. It had been the soundest investment of her life, not for the gold it contained, but for the chance it had given her to build something from nothing, to mend not just furniture, but her own fractured life. She was 20 years old, and she was home. She had taken a ruin, and with her own 2 hands, had given it a future. And in doing so, she had finally, truly, built one for herself. So the next time you pass a place that looks abandoned, a house in ruins, or a garden overgrown, perhaps pause for a moment. There is often a story hidden beneath the neglect, a potential for life, waiting for a patient hand. Thank you for being with us today. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might appreciate it, and subscribe for more tales of quiet restoration. What is something in your own life that others saw as worthless, but you were able to find the hidden value within?